The question was asked, isn't inquiry, meaning asking questions, just the effects of mind identification? Isn't it just the mind wondering about things and wanting to stabilize itself, wanting to gain more knowledge? In a word, no, it's not. So inquiry, when properly performed, as I describe in my book, and as I describe in videos and talk about frequently, inquiry has the sole purpose, especially initial inquiry when we're talking about awakening, it has the sole purpose of moving one's attention beyond the intellect, beyond the grasping mind, beyond the time-drunk mind. That is the whole point of inquiry in the way I talk about it. So, no, it's not just informational. It's not just mind identification, the mind wanting to understand something. Now, can the proper inquiry process, proper just meaning when it's actually effective in doing what I'm describing, can that process get co-opted by the mind and lead someone, or someone will lead themselves into a mere drive for understanding? Yes, that does happen, and it happens frequently. And for some people, it happens for a long time. And for others, they move past it pretty quickly. But it's definitely a tendency of the mind. Now, that's not the fault of true inquiry. That's simply the mechanism of mind that we get entangled in, that is enraptured with time and doership and self and other and cause and effect. So that part of us that does want to understand, that does want to grasp with the mind, doesn't disappear immediately. But inquiry properly utilized, properly put in place, can quickly bring you beyond the mind. I'll give one example here, but I'm not going to talk about it in depth because I had a video a few days ago that described it in depth. That is common, or the most common initial Zen koan called What is Mu, or Joshu's Mu. This is a perfect example of how a question can, by definition, by its very function, have nothing to do with intellect, understanding the mind, or mind identification. Its sole purpose is to propel one beyond it. That's just an example that's very stark because there's no way for the mind to even begin to understand Mu, essentially. But all inquiry approaches, questions, etc., are pointing at the same exact thing. They're pointing at the same exact possibility. And that possibility is one that has to happen in real time, and it has to be, you have to be fully on board, not just wondering with your mind, but with your mind, body, and spirit, willing to really let go into the question, into where the question points. That's the whole thrust of true inquiry. So whether the question is, who am I? Or what am I? Or where am I? Or what was my face before my parents were born? Or any other question, what is suffering? How to end suffering? Why do I suffer? Again, my book unpacks inquiry to a large degree, talks about various aspects of formulating a question, what comes before the question, what comes after the question, etc. And I have tons of videos on this. But what we put behind the inquiry matters. So we have to actually care about the question. We have to be curious. And that curiosity has to come from beyond the intellect. If it's simply or merely an intellectual curiosity, then yes, you'll often just lead yourself to a conceptual answer. Now, in a deeper or maybe more identity-based way of talking about this, there are those who would say any kind of activity, curiosity, questioning, spiritual practice, etc., just sort of reinforces a seeker, reinforces an illusion, reinforces the separate one that's trying to find the whole, none of which can actually happen because there is no separate one and there's essentially no whole, right? And there are prominent non-duality speakers who talk this way that wouldn't call themselves maybe teachers or even people, but they do speak this way. And they might say something like, there's no one to inquire, or who's going to inquire, right? But as I've said before, and I'll say again, when the clear realization and understanding of the implications of no self dawns, when the realization is clear, then there's no longer a need to negate a self. You don't have to ask the question, who's going to inquire, any more than you have to ask the question, who's going to go to the bathroom, or who's going to walk, or who's going to sleep. Sleeping happens, walking happens, and inquiry happens. So by the same criteria, it doesn't happen to anyone because there's no one for it to happen to. But that doesn't matter. It still happens, and it still has effects. Because there's no self to be found does not mean there's no cause and effect. The second koan in the Mumonkan, Kan, which is probably the most famous set of koans in Zen, or at least a very famous one, it's about a fox who suffers rebirths because as a Zen master, it denied the effect. It denied the existence of cause and effect, which is a mistake, because true realization, deep and profound, thoroughgoing realization, does not negate the relative world. If there's a negation of the relative world, that's not enlightenment. That's not liberation yet. It could be very deep realization and a lot of clarity, and it can transmit, but it's not enlightenment. So there is cause and effect. There is causality in the relative sense. And that doesn't necessarily imply a self. It's only from the view of a self that would imply a self. So there's no need to negate the self. There's no need to negate the relative self at all. Once the no self-realization is clear, you don't have to walk around saying, oh, there's no one here, there's nothing happening, You change your personal pronouns like I and me to this. You don't need to do that because it's like there's nothing to negate. It's like you don't have to go around negating Santa Claus for many years after you realize there's no Santa Claus. You just don't talk about Santa Claus. So unless you want to talk about Santa Claus in the relative, which means for children or for whatever reason it comes up. But you don't need to continue to convince yourself and others that Santa Claus doesn't exist. It's just obvious, right? So this is along those lines. There's no reason to talk yourself out of inquiry if the insight is not clear at any level. Inquiry is very profound, very powerful. And I would say in one form or another, all sages, teachers, direct pointing, whether it's Advaita Vedanta, whether it's Buddha himself, whether it's Dogen, whether it's contemporary non-duality teachers, with the exception of some that just speak in a very, very fixated in the absolute way. Inquiry is a valuable process. And also just practically speaking, it works. I see it work all the time. And even people who deny that there's someone who could inquire have done a lot of inquiry themselves, which results in that realization, which is, of course, the ultimate irony. So yeah, don't talk yourself out of inquiry just because you've adopted a belief that there's no one to inquire, or that mind identification is only about knowledge. So inquiry could only be about gaining knowledge. As I've said so many times, inquiry is just not about gaining knowledge. There's a type of inquiry that is, right? You can inquire about the cost of something at a store when you're shopping. You can inquire about something on the internet and learn how to do something through YouTube or through Wikipedia or whatever. Sure, you could call that inquiry, but that's just not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a process to access the truth that is beyond identity, period. And because the truth does lie beyond identity, there's an answer when you ask those questions. Something answers. And it's not a self, and it's not a person, and it's not a thought, and it's not knowledge. It's not something I can ever talk about, but it does wake up rather profoundly and in an ongoing way. So rather than adopt a belief about no self, adopt a belief about knowledge and any spiritual practice could only be trying to gain knowledge, could only be reifying a self that's doing that. Don't buy that. Don't believe that. Look into your own experience. Do you find that happening? Or does the question come up naturally from the unknown? True curiosity comes from the unknown. Not a curiosity that's satisfied by thoughts or knowledge, but a curiosity that takes you down through the depths of your fear, through the depths of your identity, through the depths of the shadow, and propels you beyond, truly beyond, just like it says at the end of the Heart Sutra, gone, gone, gone beyond, fully beyond, awake, rejoice. So it does work. Inquiry is powerful, and it does work for everyone. May not work in the time frame you want it to. You can't control this process. But you can get on board. You can be vulnerable. You can be honest with what your deepest yearning is, with your yearning to come into contact with your true nature or unfiltered reality or the unconditioned or the unborn. Whatever word you want to use, you have the right to answer that call. The call didn't come from you either, by the way. The prompting to come into contact with your true nature didn't come from you. It didn't come from your intellect. It's from far beyond that and far before it. It's from a place that is not defined by time or space. So that's all that's really happening, is we're surrendering to that. We're giving ourselves to this process that's already unfolding. And once you give yourself to it and don't hold back through intellectualizing insights, don't distract yourself unnecessarily, then you're just a participant in this process, and it's quite a ride. So take the ride. That's what we're here for. What else are we here for?